Okay, let's dive right in. When we think about how our incredibly interconnected modern world was built, we usually picture a pretty tight, recent timeline, right? Maybe ships from a few hundred years ago. But the real story of global commerce, how we actually started sharing goods, ideas, and wealth, is so much older, way grander, and honestly, a lot more complex than standard history books tend to let on. In this explainer, we're going to bust some major myths about the epic history of global trade.
So that brings us to the big question. When did true globalization actually begin? We're often taught that the modern economic world just kind of snapped into existence with European explorers crossing the Atlantic in the late 1400s. But the true timeline of globalization actually holds this fascinating central mystery. Like, was there a single big bang of trade? Or is our modern interconnectedness built on the foundations of ancient networks that were just way more advanced than we usually give them credit for?
To find the origins, we really have to zoom out. We're talking across millennia here, all the way back in the 19th century BCE. That is almost 4,000 years ago. We actually have records of Assyrian merchants running expatriate trading settlements in Bronze Age Anatolia, and they were using these really complex contracts on clay tablets. Then, fast forward a bit to 30 BCE. The Roman annexation of Egypt opens up direct access to the Red Sea, basically letting merchants ride the monsoon winds straight over to India. And then by 618 CE, you've got the Tang dynasty projecting massive power to secure the Silk Road, overseeing this colossal overland network packed with thousands of foreign merchants. The point is, this wasn't just some primitive bartering system. These were highly sophisticated trans-regional systems of exchange. And the sheer scale of this ancient commerce, it's just staggering. Take Rome, for example. When they gained access to the Indian Ocean, they didn't just passively trade, they actively taxed. The Roman Empire levied a massive 25% import tax. They called it the titarte on luxury goods like pepper, frankincense, and silk pouring in from the east. 25%? The revenues from this international trade were so astronomical that historians estimate they funded nearly a third of the entire Roman military machine. So if you think about it, the famous Pax Romana was, in a very real way, paid for by Indian Ocean trade. Now, just like today, massive international trade brought some pretty intense economic anxiety. Believe it or not, politicians were complaining about the exact same economic fears thousands of years ago. Pliny the Elder, he was a Roman commander and author, openly lamented that Rome's wealth was just draining eastward. He actually calculated that India was absorbing 50 million sesterces a year. I mean, Roman elites were literally losing sleep over their balance of trade deficits, just watching their silver and gold flow out to Indian markets in exchange for spices and silks. The human scale of all this historical trade is incredible, especially when we look at the daily lives of merchants at the Turfan Oasis, right along the edge of the treacherous Taklamakan Desert. Get this, because paper was incredibly scarce out there, locals actually recycled official government documents and commercial contracts to make paper shoes for the dead. Yeah, really. And once scholars managed to decipher these scraps, they found this completely thriving, highly monetized oasis economy. These 6th century contracts show Sogdian merchants, who were essentially the full-time trade specialists of their era, operating in multicultural towns, writing up loans with strict 10% monthly penalties, and just casually doing business using Sassaninian silver coins. It was a remarkably integrated financial environment. But as those land routes occasionally fractured over the centuries due to political shifts, humanity looked to the oceans. And that triggered a massive geographical pivot. Let's enter the 1500s. This is the era dominated by Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, sure, but also by the Manila Galleon. That was an unbelievable maritime route that linked the Americas directly to Asia, right across the Pacific Ocean. So suddenly, silver from the Americas is flowing to Asia, while silks and spices are flowing back to Europe and the New World. It completely changed the global map of power forever. And as you can probably guess, this pivot to the oceans created a massive divergence in global wealth. Starting around the year 1500, societies that had direct access to the Atlantic, places like Britain and the Netherlands, well, their urbanization rates just completely exploded compared to the rest of Western and Eastern Europe. Having access to these new transoceanic trade routes, combined with inclusive domestic institutions back home, created these booming port cities and an entirely new, ridiculously wealthy merchant class. And it was this new wealth that directly built the modern nation-state. For a long time, historians thought Britain's rise to power was funded mostly by taxing domestic production, but when researchers dug into the raw archival customs data, this totally counterintuitive insight popped out. By the year 1800, taxes on internationally traded goods, things like imported tea, tobacco, foreign spirits, those actually made up over half of the indirect tax revenue used to build the British fiscal military state. So their empire wasn't just built on domestic industry, Far from it. It was heavily, heavily financed by the taxation of global trade. So that brings us back to our crucial question. Did Columbus and the Age of Discovery actually spark the Big Bang of true globalization, like our history books suggest? I mean, we see ships crossing oceans, we see the rise of Atlantic port cities, and we see massive flows of silver. It definitely looks like globalization. But economic historians urge us to look a little closer at the data. Specifically, they want us to look at what things actually cost in different parts of the world. See, economic historians define true globalization a bit differently. It's not just about ships crossing oceans. It's about the integration of markets. Think of it like this. If you can buy a smartphone for roughly the same price in London as you can in New York, that is price convergence. Without that, you don't really have an integrated global market. If trade barriers and transport costs are actually falling, you should see a clear mathematical trail of this price convergence, where the price of, say, wheat or cloves in Europe gets much, much closer to the price of those exact same goods in Asia or the Americas. When we compare the two eras using that definition, a pretty stark contrast appears. The Age of Discovery in the 1500s and 1600s was actually choked by mercantilist monopolies, pirates, constant wars, and super high tariffs. They were mostly trading exotic luxury goods for the super rich with huge markups, so prices between continents never actually converged. But then, hit the 1820s and everything changes. The 19th century boom finally brought the transport of bulk, everyday commodities for the masses. Thanks to free trade policies and new technologies, we finally see massive global price convergence. And this, historians argue, is the real Big Bang of globalization. The sheer scale of this 19th century steamship boom is wild. Driven by the imposing industrial arrival of the steamship, the opening of the Suez Canal, and plunging maritime transport costs, global trade volumes absolutely exploded between 1870 and 1913. We are talking about an astonishing 400% increase. This was an era where the average person's daily life was tangibly transformed by cheap imported goods arriving from halfway across the planet. But here is the ultimate twist. We naturally tend to assume the steamship was the sole hero of the story, right? However, when economists isolate the variables, the data shows that this massive 19th century boom wasn't just caused by the maritime transport revolution. Actually, scratch that, it wasn't even mostly the transport revolution. An incredible 57% of this trade boom was actually driven by sweeping global income growth. People were getting richer, so they demanded more goods. The technology facilitated the trade, absolutely, but human prosperity is what actually drove the demand. Which leaves us with a totally fascinating mystery. We've seen that while ships, roads, and technology are incredibly vital, the true engines of globalization have always been human demand, institutional openness, and income growth. So, as we look at our own rapidly shifting modern world today, what's going to drive the next great era of trade? Will it be new digital technologies? Or maybe the rising wealth of developing nations? Whatever the answer is, it might just rewrite the map of global power all over again.